Boldwood presents A Christmas Wish, written by Lizzie Lane and read by Penelope Freeman. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Magda, January 1927.
Your Aunt Bridget never had bairns of her own. She'll appreciate having you come to stay with her. You'll be happy there, trust me.
Although she was only 10 years old, Magda Brodie knew her father could tell lies as though they were the absolute truth. So many times he'd promised he'd be home from sea, but didn't appear. So many times he'd promised his wife Isabella Brodie the world, and barely delivered a wage. Her young legs ached with the effort of keeping up with his long strides. Her heart ached with the pain of being parted from her twin sisters, Venetia and Anne-Marie. And when would she hear her baby brother Michael chuckle again?
And didn't you have a good Christmas?
Her father went on, as though the memory would help her adjust to a different life away from her siblings.
A lovely Christmas.
She whispered an acknowledgement that was lost against the woolen scarf covering the lower half of her face. Things had been wonderful at Christmas, despite her mother dying just a few weeks before. An elderly lamplighter on the other side of the road wished them a happy 1927. Joseph Brodie raised his free hand.
Same to you, old-timer.
His other hand remained clamped around his daughter's wrist, as though fearing she'd run away if he let go.
Could it be better than 1926?
Cried the old man, seemingly unwilling to let go of them and be left alone with his task.
What with the general strikes and all that? Would never have happened in my young day. Aye, let's hope it's better for us all, said Joseph Brodie without slowing his pace.
What about our Anna-Marie and Venetia? What about Mikey?
Asked Magda.
Oh, they'll be fine. Once I've got you settled in, then I'll do something about them. I'm waiting to hear, so I am. I'm waiting to hear before I take them to where they're to live.
I wish it was Christmas again,
she said. He didn't appear to hear her, or if he did, he chose to ignore what she said.
I wish it was,
Magda repeated, breathing the heartfelt words into the thick muffler. It had been the beginning of a grey, wet November when her mother had taken Magda, her twin sisters, and baby Michael to the workhouse in East London. She'd coughed violently between telling them it would only be temporary. Only until your father comes home from the sea. Everything will be better then. Nothing was better, and certainly not Isabella Brodie. The cough that she had had for as long as Magda could remember worsened until she was coughing blood. The decision was made to take her from the workhouse to somewhere called a sanatorium. All this happened in a maelstrom of activity, with people bustling around while speaking in low voices and entreating the children to stay out of the way. The latter was uttered with misted eyes and a shaking of heads. The wetness of late November departed, December bringing an east wind and grey fog that softened the harsh lines of grime-covered brick and sludge-coloured stone of the East End of London. The damp fog had a sickly yellow tinge and a gritty taste, suffused as it was with smoke from a million coal-fired chimneys. The workhouse kept the windows closed, the stuffiness inside preferable to the wicked weather outside. Magda asked when they could see their mother again, but was told that the disease spoiling her mother's lungs was highly contagious, and the sanatorium discouraged visitors, especially children. Halfway through December, when snow had fallen, melted and froze again over an iron-hard ground, a kindly lady at the workhouse had called them into the kitchen. The workhouse kitchen was a warm place, where great copper pans bubbled away on a big black range, the steam smelling of good things to eat. The woman had gathered the four of them around her. Magda, with her baby brother Michael in her arms. Her sisters, Venetia and Anna-Marie, had stood so close together, it seemed they were joined at the hip and shoulder. In fact, they were twins, though Venetia had dark Mediterranean looks like Magda and their mother, and Anne-Marie was fair and blue-eyed like her father.
I'm sorry to say that your mother has passed away.
3 pairs of innocent young eyes had stared back at her. Baby Michael, uncomprehending of the family tragedy, gurgling with laughter. Anna-Marie, always a little more sensitive than the others, had been the first to cry. Unwilling to show weakness to strangers, Venetia had hung her head. Magda's bottom lip had trembled, whilst her dark eyes studied the top of Michael's head.
Is our father coming to fetch us? Will we be with him for Christmas?
Her voice had been small but steady when she'd asked the question. The kindly lady, who had dedicated her life to helping the less fortunate, placed a hand over her chest as though she'd been struck with a sudden pain. She'd explained to Magda that the workhouse only catered for children when they were part of a family. It was customary for those with absent parents who could not be traced to be placed in a home for abandoned children. The kindly lady, whose name was Miss Burton, couldn't help feeling sorry for the poor mites. It wasn't normal procedure, but she had come to an abrupt conclusion.
I tell you what, my dears. You can all stay here while we try and locate your father to tell him of this tragedy. Now, how would that be?
Magda had been forthright.
Will we only stay until our father comes to fetch us and have us all live together? That's why he went away on ships, to earn enough money to buy us a nice house by the sea. That's where we'll live.
I'm sure you will, Miss Burton had responded, her generous heart touched by the child's trust in the absent parent.
Is our mother going to be an angel?
Anna-Marie had asked, her blue eyes like china saucers in her heart-shaped face.
Yes, and just in time for Christmas,
Magda had answered, with a determined set of her jaw, her little head held high. At Christmas there had been presents for all the children, and a festive feast of sorts, including a slice of chicken, crisp roast potatoes, plum pudding, and jelly and blancmange just for the children.
This is the best Christmas ever,
Venetia had proclaimed, her dark eyes bright with excitement and her mouth full of pudding. Magda's first inclination had been to say that it couldn't be the best, not with their mother lately buried, but on reflection she decided not to. Instead she said,
When we're rich and living by the sea, we'll have the best Christmas ever. You just see if we don't. Promise?
Anna-Marie had lisped, having just lost a front milk tooth the night before.
Hope springs eternal,
her sister had responded. She didn't know where she'd read that, but it sounded good, and certainly hopeful. The twins had been given a game of snakes and ladders for Christmas. It was whilst the three of them were playing the game, Venetia declaring hotly that it was her turn and that her sisters were cheating, that a shadow had fallen over them. Tall, dark, and smelling of black tobacco and sea salt, her father had finally arrived, his presence as big as his body, and the smile on his bluff and bonny face.
Your father's home from the sea, he'd proclaimed. So, how are my darling kids?
The dice had rolled with the counters across the game board as the twins jumped to their feet, throwing their arms around him with such gusto that he staggered backwards. Only Magda had held back, half fearing it was a mirage, and he would vanish if she dared acknowledge that he was there. Finally there.
Our mother's gonna be a Christmas angel,
Anna-Marie had declared once she'd unwrapped her arms from around his waist. Her father had looked down at Michael, who looked back at him warily, not sure at all who this strange man could be.
Son,
their father had said. He had made no attempt to pick the baby up.
Magda,
he'd said finally, turning to her once he'd brushed the twins from his side.
My, how you've grown. Aren't you going to give your old dad a hug now?
Young as she was, she'd heard his warm regards every time he came home from the sea, and made excuses to their mother as to why there wasn't much money for all his efforts. Once he'd realised he was not going to get the welcome from her that he'd had from the others, he took her to one side and told her of where she would be living now that her mother was dead. Whilst she was still trying to take it in, he had said to her,
Magda, you have to be brave. For the little one's sake, you have to be brave, my girl.
Even now his words jarred. She closed her eyes and thought about making a Christmas wish. Her wish was that her father had never come home, and that she was still with her sisters and little brother. When she opened her eyes again, nothing had changed. The weather was still bitingly cold, though her father, Joseph Brodie, strode along as though the day was fine, and a bitter wind was not beating in their faces. The small girl at his side would only come to know when she was older that confidence was her father's shield against the world and the guilt within him. He was ripping the family apart, but Joseph Brodie was a selfish man who people, especially women, found easy to love. Besides that, he was not a man ever to admit that what he was doing was wrong. She saw the grim surroundings, the alleys piercing between terraces of dirty red brick houses, the smell of dirt, drains, and smoke from the chimneys. It was hard to be brave. She didn't feel brave. She felt helpless. Finally, she found her voice.
"When will I see our Venetia again?"
In time. In time.
His response was curt, though bright, as though everything in the world was lovely. His grip on her hand tightened. Perhaps he suspected she had it in mind to run away. But she was a child. It was in her nature to love those close to her, to trust her father, just as she had her mother.
"When will I see my sisters and brother again?"
When things are better, I've told you. All the details of where they'll be living are in your mother's Bible. Still, you saw them at Christmas. Despite everything, you had Christmas together. Now, wasn't that a good thing?
Magda had to concede that it was. The family had clung together and she'd tried her best, as the eldest, to reassure them that everything would be fine.
"When you come home again, will you buy that house by the sea that our mamma talked about where we can all be together?"
Is that what she told you?
He sounded more than surprised, perhaps a little taken aback.
"Yes, and we'll all live with you, together, and next Christmas I shall cook us all Christmas dinner with a turkey, or perhaps a chicken,"
she added, changing her mind, because he might think a turkey too expensive. And after all, if he was going to buy a cottage by the sea, wouldn't that be better than a turkey? And houses cost money. Her mother had told her so when she'd questioned why they lived in 2 cold rooms in a shared house. She swiped a hand at the tears clinging to her lashes, her fingers cold despite the thickness of her knitted mitten. The new year had blown in bitterly cold with the threat of snow. The sky was no more than a ribbon between the cramped roofs and crooked chimneys of the narrow streets they trod. She noticed that some windows in the tiny houses still had paper chains or pretend snow, no more than bits of cotton wool stuck to the panes. A few more days, perhaps only hours, and the real thing would start to fall. It was that cold. Every so often her father, Joe Brodie, would glance at her, see that she was far from happy, and then commence to tell her how grand things would be when he once again returned from sea.
"And I'll buy you a dolly with eyes that close, and she'll be wearing a pink dress."
The rag doll she was carrying beneath her arm was the one thing connecting her present with her past, and had been given to her by a kindly neighbour some years before. This year's Christmas present had been a colouring book and some crayons. It was stuffed into the paper carrier bag that swung from her father's left hand, along with the few bits of clothes she owned. The cobbles were slippery underfoot, the afternoon fast turning into a wintry twilight. Magda shivered. She was the eldest, so her father had told her to be his big, brave girl, and to be an example to the little ones. Being brave, she'd decided, wasn't easy, and she didn't like this place he'd brought her to. At least the workhouse had become familiar territory, even though she had only resided there for a few months. Despite the biting wind, Magda raised her head, narrowing her eyes as she took in the drab surroundings with increasing dismay. Her nose wrinkled at the smell of old drains, decay and dirt.
"Dad, I don't like it here. This place stinks."
Though her mouth was muffled by her scarf, her voice was clear. Her father shook his head, refusing to admit that things were bad because that's the way he was. The arrangements he'd made for his children suited him, and that was all that mattered. He was blind to anything else.
"No, no, Magda, my girl. You're overreacting. It's poor but honest around here, and your aunt will be good to you. You just see. Everything'll be fine, my girl."
Her mother had come from Italy, a place, she'd told Magda, where the sun always shone. Joseph Brodie had sailed into Naples and charmed the dark-haired, dark-eyed young girl into marrying him. With his melodic voice, his broad shoulders and his dancing blue eyes, the handsome Irishman had stolen her heart away. "Love at first sight," she'd said to her children in her lilting voice, before a sad look had come over her features. "I loved him despite all his faults, his many faults, and I love him still." The fact was that for all his charm, Joseph Brodie was feckless. There was no way he could settle down to a life with a wife and children, tied to the land. He reckoned the sea was in his blood. The fortune he'd promised his bride never came their way. Isabella Giulietta Brodie had worked at anything and everything she could to keep a roof over their heads and bread on the table. Eventually the hard work and starvation rations had caught up with her. Eventually they were turned out of their lodgings and sent to the workhouse. Though the diet was basic, it was better than they'd had, and her mother had promised there were better times to come once she was back on her feet. "Especially when your father comes home. We will all be happy then." With her last breath, her mother had expressed her love for her husband and asked the nice nurse to tell the children to behave for him. It wasn't to say that Joseph Brodie wasn't upset by his wife's death. He was, though the fact that his children needed him was not something he wished to face. Going to sea was a habit he found difficult to break. It was as though he had two lives, one with his wife and one with his shipmates, visiting one port after another all over the world.
"Anyway," he'd said to those who would listen, "what would I be doing living on the land, working in a factory or a mine, even on me father's farm? It wouldn't suit, that it wouldn't, not at all."
Just for a while, though, his exuberance for life at sea was temporarily jettisoned in favour of a brief mourning. On the day of Magda's departure, the three older children had clasped their arms around each other, shivering and sobbing into each other's shoulders. Baby Michael had looked up at them wide-eyed and frightened until he too was crying for someone he didn't yet know that he'd lost. Magda had exchanged a soft whisper with her twin sisters.
"No matter what, we must be strong for each other."
She also promised them that one day they would have that Christmas dinner in a place to call home. She didn't know when it would be, but it would happen.
"I swear to you it will. And I'll send you a Christmas card every year and write you letters. That's what people do when they're not together."
Daring to hope that things really would be better, Magda had asked her father couldn't he reconsider, and all of them live together, and he not go to sea any more. He'd shaken his head.
"I can't stay, Magda, I have to go. I have a living to make. But first I'll make arrangements for you all. You'll all be fine, you'll be sorted, I promise. And all the places where each of you are living are in your mother's Bible," he'd said. "Magda's the eldest. Magda will keep it with her. Right, Magda?"
For his part, Joseph Brodie told himself he was doing the right thing, though deep down, if he was honest, he would have to admit that he was behaving as he'd always behaved. No matter who loved him and who he loved, in his own way, of course, he tended to do things to suit himself. Yes, he felt grieved that he hadn't been there for his wife, but he blamed others for that. The wages on board every ship he'd ever worked on, every far-flung port where the bartenders relieved him of his hard-earned cash, and, once drunk as a lord, every dockside whore who'd reminded him of his wife. Close to the city docks, terraced houses, crumbling from years of neglect by absentee landlords, lined cobbled streets. This part of London was home to all manner of folk, poor, honest, and dishonest. Poverty and crime rubbed shoulders out of necessity. Making a living by any means possible meant holding on to life. Only the coffin maker on the corner of Cox Passage and Edward Street, the street they were heading for, had an unending source of business. Creaking signs above lopsided doorways advertised chimney sweeps and cobblers. Old inns rubbed shoulders with rope makers, coopers and tenements, housing at least one family on each floor. Pale-faced children peered from dark interiors or played out in the street with bits of wood or stones. The former were floated on sooty puddles, the fallout from the smoking chimney pots, the gasworks, and the coal yard at the end of the street where it abutted the river. Little had changed since the Great War. A man sitting against the wall outside the pub begged them for alms. He was wearing the top half of an old navy uniform. 3 or 4 medals dangled from the breast pocket. Her father stopped.
"Where did you serve?"
"Jutland. German 8-inch took me legs off."
Magda noticed the man was sitting on a wooden board that had wheels on. She noticed with the fascination a child feels for the unusual that he had no legs. Her father tossed him a coin.
"Have a half on me, old fella. I wasn't so far from there myself."
The man's face lit up.
"You're an officer and a gentleman."
Joseph laughed.
"Sure I am. How'd you guess?"
The man disappeared into the pub, the door swinging shut behind him, though not before a hubbub of conversation, stale smells, and amber light had fallen out onto the pavement. In an oppressive street beneath an oppressive January sky, Joseph Brodie knocked at the battered door of his sister-in-law. The house was a straightforward 2-up, 2-down terraced, one of about 8 all strung together, and it looked like the poorest in the street. Aunt Bridget was married to James Brodie, Joseph's brother, who worked as an able seaman on the pig boats that plied between London and Cork. Irish pork was best, according to Bridget Brodie, leanest and freshest.
"Sure isn't it slaughtered just on down the road here?"
Joseph Brodie knew this was true. Depending on the wind, the screams of the pigs smelling blood and death travelled from the slaughterhouse with unnerving regularity. Bridget Brodie did not possess the same calm tone as her brother-in-law. Neither was she purposeful in her movements, darting around and doing everything at breakneck, slapdash speed. Being bereft of children had made her bitter, though perhaps because he was a man, Joseph Brodie couldn't see what she'd become. If he had, perhaps, he would have thought twice about leaving his daughter there. Her sharp eyes, blue in a complexion that erred towards pink, as though she'd been toasted in front of the fire, fixed on Magda.
"She has her mother's colouring. The others had yours. I saw them once."
"Would you hold that against her?"
She shrugged.
"I'm not to speak ill of the dead, though you know my thoughts on foreigners."
She crossed her flat chest in a swift stabbing movement.
"We got enough of them in this place as it is. Jews one end, blacks the other. God knows but this place is going downhill."
"'Tis only to be expected. You living so close to the docks. Ships come in to London from all over the world. You're bound to get people here from all over."
Bridget Brodie eyed him sharply.
"That don't mean they have to stay here. I see them going across the way there too,"
she said, nodding towards the house across the street.
"'Tis a whorehouse, you know." "My God," she said, crossing herself again. "What would my old mother think if she knew her daughter was living opposite a whorehouse?"
"Sure you don't know that for sure."
"Too right I do, Joe Brodie. Men, mostly sailors, going in and out of there at all hours. 'Tis disgraceful, I say, plain disgraceful."
Controlling any hint of guilt, Brodie looked across to a gabled building, its upper floor overhanging the lower. It had likely been there since the first sailor sauntered past, smoking a rolled-up leaf of best Virginian tobacco and wondering what he could do with the potatoes he'd also brought back with him. For the first time since laying his plan, he experienced a twinge of doubt. But beggars couldn't be choosers. He firmly believed that in a few years the 10-year-old Magda would be close to being a woman, and as such needed female guidance, and certainly not the likes of him. She might find it hard at first, perhaps, but she'd thank him for it later. Sure she would. And wasn't his sister-in-law an upright, God-fearing woman?
"He'll do the Christian thing,"
he said as he counted out 10 shillings into her waiting palm.
"There's something to be going on with. I'll get more to you later."
Her sharp eyes softened at the sight of coins tumbling into her palm.
"That I will,"
she said, a smile curving her lips. If he'd looked closer, he would have seen that her smile did not travel to her eyes. She tucked the coins down the neck of her cheap dress between her breasts and sighed with satisfaction. She saw his eyes follow the progress of the money into her cleavage, and it warmed her. Suddenly her attitude changed. The red-faced woman with her squinty eyes and overblown figure took on the simpering attributes of a streetwise girl, one whose sole purpose in life was seducing a man she had a fancy for.
"Will you stay and have a cup of tea with me? Or stay a bit longer and go to the pub tonight?"
He shook his head.
"I've got to go and deliver me other kids to where they're going. The addresses where they'll be found are all in here."
He lifted the Bible, then looked at Magda, the doubt about leaving her still in evidence, but slowly retreating in the face of expediency.
"Isabella's Bible is to go into my Magda's keeping. I've listed the addresses of those who know where the others can be found at the front of this book, and also there's details of how to get hold of me. Magda will take care of it so that even if I drown at sea, she can take over and get the family back together. Can you do that for me, Magda? I promise it won't be for long. We'll all be together in no time once I've made me fortune and returned from the sea for good. No time at all."
"Yes, Dad,"
Magda said, though she said it softly, the words sticking in the dryness of her throat. He was leaving again, leaving her, leaving the others, just as he'd left her mother. During all this time of listening to him and his brother's wife, she'd felt her body growing colder and colder. The chill was only partly down to the dampness of the house, where she'd already noticed fungus growing in one corner. The fire in the grate did little to warm the room, a spiral of damp-looking smoke rising lazily from the solid black coal. The fact was, she did not want to be here, but was too young, too weak, to disobey her father's wishes. With trembling hands she took her mother's Bible from her father and clasped it to her breast. Satisfied that all appeared to be well, Brodie took Magda to one side and bowed to her level. "I've given your aunt money for your needs. You'll be safe till I come back. Now I'll be off to take care of the others. Remember, they're all written in here." He tapped the Bible that she was hugging as tightly as a more favoured child would a doll or a teddy bear. Magda felt her eyes fill with tears. Her father, Joseph Brodie, was the linchpin between her past and her future, whatever that was likely to be, and he was leaving. Aunt Bridget took hold of her shoulders.
"Come on, Magda,"
she said soothingly, the dampness of her hands permeating through Magda's coat.
"Be a good girl and let your father go now. He's work to do, and you, my girl, have to be brave."
Joe Brodie ducked out of the door. Once outside, he stopped and turned.
"Be a good girl for your Aunt Bridget. I'll be in touch soon."
Together they watched him stride off down the street, Magda frozen to the spot, her Aunt Bridget still holding on to her shoulders. The women in the house across the road were leering out of their windows, calling at him to come back and stay with them a while.
"You won't regret it, sweetheart,"
one of them called. Aunt Bridget turned a thunderous expression in their direction and brandished a threatening fist at them.
"Sluts! You're all sluts, and the sooner you all burn in hell, the better this world will be. Don't tell us, Bridget Brodie, you're as pure as the driven snow, or perhaps the Virgin Mary."
The woman's words brought laughter from the other women gathered with her, women of every colour, every shape and size.
"Foul-mouthed trollops,"
Aunt Bridget shouted back.
"Been to the Red Cow of late, have you, Bridget? Drank only milk and sat with your legs crossed, did ya?"
Aunt Bridget scowled in their direction.
"Hussies, hussies all of them."
Magda looked up at her.
"What do they mean?" "Wave to your father,"
growled Bridget Brodie, her tone altered and her fist thudding into Magda's back.
"Show your gratefulness, darky,"
she said. Alarmed by the form of address, Magda turned up and looked into Bridget Brodie's face. The blue eyes were sharp as bits of broken glass. The mouth that had smiled now pursed into self-righteous tightness. Fear flooded Magda's stout young heart. Lunging for the street, she shouted,
"Dad, come back!"
She only managed one shout before she was pulled back into the mean room, the door slamming tightly shut. Her eyes remained fixed on that closed door. Had her father heard her? Was he coming back? She wished that he would.
"Well,"
said Bridget Brodie, fists fixed on her hips, her expression dark and evil.
"You've got no family now. No stuck-up foreign mother around to spoil you with your foreign ways. 4 children living, and her ungrateful enough to go and die. And here's me with no child to call my own. Now you've to rough it, my girl, just like everybody else around here."
Magda's eyes filled with tears, but still clutching her mother's Bible, she held her head high. She would not cry. All this would pass as all things pass, just like her time in the workhouse.
"I'm Magdalena Brodie, and one day I'll be a lady."
Bridget Brodie looked amused.
"Well, will you now? Well, there's pride for you. And pride is one of the deadly sins. Do you know that?"
Her aunt's expression turned sour. Magda cried out as rough hands marched her to the other side of the room, where she was forced to kneel before a plaster statue with a pale face and even paler hands. The statue stood in a roughly formed alcove behind which light shone from the outside through a small glass pane.
"There. Now ask the Blessed Virgin for forgiveness, and don't get up till you're sorry for your ways, and bow your head respectfully," she said, landing a parting blow at the back of her head, forcing it forward. Magda squeezed her eyes tightly shut and prayed as never before to the Mother of God, all the time clutching the Bible tightly to her chest. Bridget Brodie saw how attached Magda was to that Bible, and decided she was not finished with the girl yet. Twisted with hate, she wrenched the Bible from Magda's grasp. "I'll take that, my girl. You'll have it back when I say so and not before." "That was my mother's. My father said I was to take care of it."
Another slap around the head.
"Are you deaf, girl? You'll have it when I say so. Isn't that what I've just told you? Now, get back to asking the Blessed Virgin for forgiveness, and don't get up until I tell you to."
She pushed her back to where she'd been and kicked into the back of the child's knees so that they buckled underneath her. Bridget Brodie's eyes glittered with satisfaction. At long last she had some power over Joseph Brodie, or at least over one of his brats. She would enjoy this time. She was determined to do so. Damn Joseph Brodie, damn his foreign wife. If he'd kept his promise to her when she'd been single and plain old Bridget McCarthy, then perhaps she might have had babies with him. As it was, she'd been rejected, and in being rejected had married his brother and had no babies. It was all Isabella's fault. But now Isabella was gone. The sin of the mother had fallen onto the daughter, and Bridget Brodie would make her pay for it. Chapter 2. The Twins.
"I like the boat,"
said Venetia to her sister.
"It was the best part."
Anna-Marie eyed her twin with frightened eyes that shone like glass in a face that was paler than normal. Her lips were still blue, even though they'd long left the boat that had brought them across the Irish Sea. They'd caught a train then, a bus, to Dunavon, a town that would have been swallowed up as a suburb in London. Anna-Marie wished desperately that she was still in London simply because it was all that she'd ever known. They made their way to where a pony and trap waited for them. Not a bus, a horse-drawn vehicle. They'd seen horse-drawn brewery drays back in London, but never a pony pulling a cart meant for passengers.
"There. No, this is your grandfather. Say hello to him."
Their father sounded bright and breezy, but his manner was deferential, as though he feared the man sitting up front in the trap. The twins eyed the white-haired man, who likewise eyed them. His eyes were frightening blue, perhaps because he didn't blink, but looked at each of them as though in two minds whether he liked them or not. Even their father, who never seemed afraid of anyone, had taken off his cap, screwing it around in his hands like a schoolboy about to be caned. The girls dutifully muttered a muted hello, their voices tinny like the sound of clockwork when it's fast running down. Their grandfather grunted in a gravelly voice. "I'll get aboard. I haven't got all day." Joseph Brodie hoisted the two girls and their meagre luggage into the back of the cart. "Be good," he whispered. The cart dipped to one side as he got up in the front seat alongside his father. "Get up." The girls started at the command as much as the pony between the shafts. It began to rain, a soft, incessant drizzle from which Ireland, as they later came to find out, was famous. Their father half turned in his seat. "Pull the tarpaulin up over you. That'll keep you dry." He helped them do it. Out of the rain, but not liking the smell, the two girls wrinkled their noses.
"It stinks," whispered
Venetia. Anna-Marie just stared at her, fearing that if she opened her mouth to comment, the white-haired man with the fierce blue eyes might hear. She hadn't liked the sound of his voice. She could never imagine herself ever speaking to him just in case she said the wrong thing. He was too frightening. The two men up front also pulled bits of tarpaulin up over their shoulders. Both stared silently ahead, eyes narrowed against the icy beat of the needle-fine rain. Water trickled from their eyebrows, their noses and their chins, and down their necks, soaking their clothes. Each man smouldered with his own thoughts, though one more angrily than the other. "I do mean it, father," Joseph Brodie began hesitantly. "I've got the wanderlust out of my system, honest I have." Dermot Brodie grunted. He didn't sound convinced. His son swiped the water away from his eyes, thinking how he could convince the old man that he was a reformed character, deserving to be applauded for his efforts. "I know I've let you down, you and mother, but I mean what I say. And don't I have the children to consider now that Isabel is gone?" His father grunted again. "As soon as I've settled the girls, I'll go back over to England and fetch Magda. After all, I can't expect Bridget to look after her forever. And then there's Michael, a little Mikey. I was thinking he was too young for the crossing, just him, a baby and all that. The good folk I've left him with will make sure he's well taken care of until I go back for him too. And then won't that be grand, the whole family back together again?" He glanced at his father's bearish profile, the white eyebrows, the hair, the grim set of the mouth. He wanted a sign that he'd been believed, even though, as usual, he'd somewhat embellished the truth. He'd taken money for Michael, and most of that was already gone. With little coinage left in his pockets, he had no choice but to return to sea. The truth was that he had no intention of bringing either his eldest daughter or his baby son over to Ireland. Magda would be all right. She'd be grown soon. As for Michael, well, the Darbys had made him an offer he couldn't refuse. They were without children, and he had children in need of a home and a mother. If he delved deeply into his heart of hearts, he might admit to himself that he'd never wanted children. He'd wanted Isabella, his Italian beauty, and the only way he could have her was to marry her. She'd made that pretty plain from the start. He wouldn't have done it for any other woman but Isabella. He'd done it for her, the love of his life. The town of Dunavon was left behind, the plain, no-nonsense facades of down-market Victorian buildings and squat cottages giving way to hedgerows and fields. Damp, cold and frightened, the girls peered out from beneath their covering, cowering together for comfort as well as warmth. The sight of so much greenery was new to them. London just couldn't compete. Anna-Marie eyed it with interest, Venetia with dismay. Venetia had liked the shops and bustle of a big city. She didn't like the look of this at all. Anna-Marie, however, was beginning to relax. She was still frightened of the old man sitting up front, but if she could only escape into those fields now and again, she might forget he existed. They turned off the narrow road into one that was no more than a lane, its surface pitted with stones and craters that were presently full of water. They were about to arrive at Loskerran Bridge Farm. Their father, sitting up front, locked his gaze on the old farmhouse, the only one of 2 stories in the whole area. Though better than most, it still looked mean when compared to buildings he'd seen all over the world. Not that he could voice his opinion. His father was a proud man and would hit him down for it. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, as though fighting against the rain in its efforts to reach the sky. Nothing much had changed since he'd left. The pigs still smelled the way he'd remembered them, the chickens still clucked around the yard, and the few cows his father owned stared at him as they chewed cud in rain-soaked fields. Joseph Brodie could always be counted on to put a brave face on things. He could also charm the birds off the trees, or so his shipmates often said, and indeed he believed this to be true. He could charm anybody, with one exception. His father spit on the ground before stepping down from the gig.
"I don't believe a bloody word you're saying."
His son had already alighted, leaving him with the pony and trap.
My darling Joe.
Molly Brodie's arms were locked tight around the broad back of her favourite son, her firstborn, her lovely boy and the light of her life. Dermot grimaced. From the moment they'd received the letter telling them their son's intentions, Molly had been over the moon, springing about the place sprightlier than she'd done in years.
You have to give the boy a chance,
she'd said when he'd voiced his opinion that their son was lying and would leave them literally holding the baby. Not that he minded having his granddaughters under his roof, but they'd be little help around the farm. Nothing like a strong son, that was for sure. But was Joe telling the truth? Would he stay and work on the farm? Molly had pleaded with Dermot, the same way she used to plead when his sons were boys and he'd taken off his belt. Not enough times, in his opinion, but for the most part he'd given in to her, just as he was doing now.
Well, will you look at you now,
said the kindly woman whom the twins were told was their grandmother.
Soaked through. Well, let's get you inside and out of those wet things. After that I've mutton stew simmering, fresh bread and our own butter, and a cake. Do either of you girls like cake?
That night the girls snuggled up together in a double bed in a room they'd been told was theirs and theirs alone.
That cake was lovely,
said Venetia.
And so was the stew. I heard our dad say that he's bringing over Magda and Michael soon, then we'll all be together. I like it here,
murmured Anna-Marie, barely able to keep her eyes open. She was so warm, so tired, and so full of good food.
I like the pony. He's called Merrylegs, and we're to call our grandfather Grandfa. Gran said that he'd like that.
Venetia hugged her sister closer.
We won't be here forever. One day we'll go back to London. I'm going to ask Dad when he's going back to bring our Magda and Michael over. I'm going to ask him if I can go with him. I'm not. I'm going to stay here and play with the animals.
Venetia said that farm animals were for eating, not playing with, but Anna-Marie was fast asleep. In the morning, Venetia got up with the sound of chickens out in the yard and somebody shouting,
"I told you so, woman. I told you so."
She dressed quickly, at the same time hissing at her sister that she was off downstairs to ask their father if she could go to England with him. Anna-Marie eyed her sleepily.
You go. I'll stay here.
Venetia almost tumbled down the stairs in her haste to get hold of her father and ask him to take her with him. The warmth of the kitchen, the smell of bread baking and thick slices of bacon sizzling in the pan was like heaven on a damp Irish morning. Gran was clattering dishes and pans around and looked upset.
Where's my dad?
The question was heard by her grandfather as he came in from outside, bringing a mist of dampness with him.
Gone.
His boots clumped on the scrubbed flagstones as he made a move to wash his hands before breakfast. Venetia, her dark eyes filling with fear for what she was about to hear, stood with her mouth open.
Is he coming back?
She asked. Dermot Brodie wasn't listening. He was shaking a finger in front of his wife's face as she dished up his bacon and eggs and shouting at the top of his voice,
"Didn't I tell you so? Didn't I?"
Venetia felt her legs go weak. Her grandmother saw her and cast anxious eyes at her husband.
"Have a care for the child, Dermot. She's been through enough losing her mother and all that."
Dermot Brodie straightened and looked at Venetia.
"Your father lied to me, girl. His own father. He never meant to stay. He's always gone his own way and he's no different now than he's ever been. Your father's gone back to sea. You might see him again or you might not. Either way, it looks as though we're stuck with the pair of you."
Chapter 3. Magda. Magda Brodie watched as her aunt locked the front door behind her. She was off to the pub to see her friend, as she put it. Magda sighed. Her world had become very small, seen only via the small windows at the front of the house. She had a good view of the grander house across the way, where gentlemen callers arrived by taxi or chauffeur-driven car, and mostly at night. Only a few came on foot, and then furtively, their coat collars turned up as though reluctant to be recognised. Sometimes one of the girls living across the road would see her looking out and would wave to her. She'd wave back, the small action raising her spirits. Sometimes she would see one of the girls talking to an old woman who limped. She saw their eyes stray across to her and knew she was the subject of their conversation. On these occasions she shrank back into the gloomy room, fearful lest they tell her aunt that she'd spent time between chores gazing out at a world that she was forbidden to join. There were no books in Aunt Bridget's sorry abode, except for the Bible, kept enticingly high above her head. Magda missed the books she'd once read. They had been borrowed from an old man who kept a second-hand shop on the Fulham Road. His main merchandise had been second-hand furniture. He'd lent her those books in part exchange for her mother's sewing box.
"But only to lend," he'd said to her. "Might have a paying customer with a library one day."
She'd loved those books. Fairy stories and adventures, books full of magic, beautiful princesses and honourable princes. And there were always bad fairies and witches, though none of them frightened her, not like Aunt Bridget. In the absence of books, she made up stories about the young women in the house across the road, the old lady, the gentlemen callers. The girls were captive princesses, all waiting for the right prince to answer the right riddle. So far, none of the gentlemen callers had answered the riddle correctly, which was why all the princesses were still there, none of them leaving on a white horse with their favoured Prince Charming. As for the witch, well, there was no doubt who that was, and she herself was the most beautiful captive princess of all, subject of a wicked curse and sealed in a cold, dark prison. Spring came, and the weather turned warmer. The girls opposite were wearing prettier dresses of all different colours. They looked like butterflies. Sometimes they looked very happy. Sometimes they looked sad or tired of the world at large, but at least they were free to come and go, Magda thought, and for a while she envied them. It was a sunny morning, a fresh breeze blowing dust and paper along the street, when Magda saw the dark side of the life of the girls across the road. One of the girls was shouting and screaming, hanging onto a man for all she was worth. When he pushed her, she fell to the ground, her hands curling protectively across her belly. The older woman, the one Magda viewed as the fairy godmother in her story, came out of the house. She couldn't hear the words clearly, just enough to know that the younger one was being encouraged to leave the man and go into the house. The girl, who looked quite plump to Magda's eyes, shook her head, her hair flying wildly around her face. She lunged at the man, trying to hold on to him. He pushed her again, this time so violently that she fell backwards and fell full stretch on the ground. Then he kicked her. Magda covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with horror. Other women came out of the house to help the injured girl inside. They disappeared. Only the older woman remained, her face like marble, staring in the direction the man had taken. The old woman caught sight of Magda watching from her puny window and shook her head again as though sharing a sad thought before retiring. A few days later, Magda saw two men arrive in a hearse. A long black car like this had taken their mother away to the cemetery. Had the man pushed the girl hard enough to kill her? One of the black-clothed men in the hearse went into the house with something tucked beneath his arm. The man in black came back out, his head tilted forward, eyes fixed on the tiny white box he carried. That's what he'd taken into the house, though covered then. Now it was obvious. The parcel beneath his arm had contained a tiny coffin. She saw the women dabbing their eyes as they followed the hearse. There were only 3 of them, the mother of the child, another girl supporting her, and the fairy godmother. Seeing the small coffin, Magda's thoughts turned to her baby brother. Was he still alive? When her aunt rolled in from her favourite drinking haunt, her face redder than usual, her clothes dishevelled, and her breath smelling of brown ale, Magda dared ask her about contacting her family.
"I could write to them,"
she said hopefully, glancing up to where her mother's Bible sat on the high shelf. Aunt Bridget slumped heavily into a chair.
"Your father didn't leave enough money for feeding you, my girl, let alone writing letters. Eat up that stew. You'll get no pampering here, not in this house."
Magda sighed. Food was mostly thin soups, stews, and hunks of bread thickly spread with pork dripping or plum jam. Not that Aunt Bridget denied herself a decent meal. Pig's tails, ox tongue, lamb chops, and pork sausages. She devoured them all, the scraps left to the child, whose big eyes were beginning to look even bigger in her heart-shaped face due to lack of sustenance. Aunt Bridget fell into a deep sleep, her head back, her mouth open, and emitting a full-bodied snore. The steam from the soup misted the windows. Whilst her aunt lay snoring in the chair, Magda wrote the initials of her sisters' names with her fingernail in the condensation. Then she wrote a large M for Michael.
"I miss you,"
she whispered.
"I miss all of you."
Behind her, Aunt Bridget let out a resounding snore that almost woke her up. Magda froze. The moment of fear passed. The snoring continued unabated. The fire was as mean and smoky as ever, and there was no point in piling on any more coal. The coal itself was contained in a pine box to one side of the grate. A cardboard box holding newspapers and bits of kindling sat the other side. The kettle, its spout black and its handle grease-covered, hummed like a pet cat on the hob. Magda shivered. No matter the time of year, the house was damp. It paid to keep moving about in order to stay warm. Even in bed, Magda shivered beneath the thin, smelly blanket that Bridget had rejoiced in telling her had once covered a horse. She eyed the cardboard box, the newspapers, and the pieces of butcher's paper in which her aunt's supper had been wrapped. The misted window panes, the butcher's paper, and even the box containing it, had given her an idea. Being careful not to make a noise, she slid each piece of paper out of the box and smoothed it flat. Those that were too smeared with blood she put back into the box. She was left with 2 good sheets that weren't too crumpled. Sucking in her lips, she eyed each carefully. They'd do very well for writing paper, and would give her something to do during the day. And not just letters. She thought about that last Christmas they'd been together. Miss Burton at the workhouse had received lots of Christmas cards decorated with snow scenes, jolly snowmen, or red-breasted robins. The kindly Miss Burton had let her look at one that she'd received. Inside, it had said Merry Christmas. Magda glanced over her shoulder to make sure Aunt Bridget still slept soundly. The open mouth, the dribble running through the hairs of her chin, along with the recurring noises, declared that she was. Magda folded both sheets of paper in half, then in half again. There were scissors in the dresser drawer. Again she had to be careful, easing the stiff old drawer out of its cavity, bit by squeaky bit. By the time she'd finished, she had 4 pieces of paper from the 2 sheets. These she folded in half, flattening them again as best she could. Sucking in her bottom lip, she eyed the creamy-coloured paper, and the wrinkles that were still there, though not so obvious as they had been. They were not as stiff as proper shop-bought cards, but she told herself that her sisters and little brother wouldn't mind that. It would be good to hear from her, and that was really all that mattered. A snort from Aunt Bridget made her start and hug the pieces of paper to her chest. Nothing would give her aunt greater pleasure than guessing her plan and throwing the lot into the fire.
"We'll be having none of that," she would sneer. "No writing in this house."
Indeed, Bridget Brodie did not own a pencil, let alone a book. Leaving her aunt sleeping, Magda stole up to bed, hid the paper beneath her pillow, and said a little prayer.
"Please, God, I'm going to write letters, a diary, and make cards for my sisters and brother. I can't remember their birthdays, so I'll just make Christmas cards if that's all right with you. Those old crayons from the workhouse are a bit worn down, but will do for the colouring in. As for the writing, well, I would prefer to write with a pencil. Please, God, I need a pencil."
Chapter 4. The Twins. 1929. Molly Brodie glanced out of the kitchen window, saw the pony and trap turn at the end of the lane, and watched until it was out of sight. The girls had been living with her and her husband for nearly 2 years now, and she was enjoying their company, more so when Dermot was not around. He was growing older and grumpier, disappointed with his sons and dissatisfied with the world at large. Molly enjoyed having her granddaughters to herself.
"Right,"
she said, turning round to her granddaughters. "It's time for us girls to have some fun." The twins exchanged looks of excitement and giggled, Anna Marie's face turning pink because going behind her grandfather's back was always a little frightening. Eyes bright with anticipation, Molly Brodie bent her head to the gramophone, and after winding it up, placed the needle onto the edge of the record. "Charleston!" she shouted gleefully, and proceeded to dance. The girls joined in. This, they discovered, was their grandmother's secret sin. She loved to dance. She'd always loved to dance, so she'd told them. "But your grandfather thinks it's heathen because it came from America some years ago, and although all those Irish people have gone over there and see how grand it is, he doesn't think anywhere can be as good as Ireland." It had become their habit to wait until he was off into Dunavon to fetch supplies and drink with Roger Casey, the builder. Out would come the record from its secret hiding place, the needle would be inserted, and the handle wound up. Once they'd danced themselves breathless, they collapsed with laughter. The girls huddled around their grandmother's legs. That's when she would tell them about America and her wish as a young girl to go there. "I thought your grandfather would take me there, but he had a glib tongue. What he promised and his real intentions were two entirely different things." The two girls listened avidly. Their grandmother was good at describing what this other country was like, and they lapped it up. "Do you know they have the highest buildings in the world? Great big towering things that look as though they're stabbing the passing clouds. And a big statue at the entrance to New York Harbour. That's what people have told me, and I've no reason to doubt the truth of what they say." Sighing with the sadness of unachieved dreams, she laid her head back against the chair and closed her eyes. "I wonder what my life would have turned out like if your grandfather had been true to his word. Folk that have been there tell me the streets are paved with gold, and that's where they make the pictures, you know. That's where Clara Bow, Mary Pickford and Charlie Chaplin live. Not in New York, mind you. I hear they live in a place called Hollywood." "I think I'd like to go there, to America," said Venetia, her small hand covering the work-worn fingers of her grandmother. "I think I'd like to be a film star like Clara Bow." She remembered the posters outside the picture houses in London. "I don't want to stay in Ireland," she added. "I want excitement, I want adventure, I want to dance and sing on the stage and in the films." Anna Marie eyed her sister timidly. "I couldn't do that, sing and dance in front of people." "You don't need to," said Venetia. "You can come with me. We have to stay together, always." Anna Marie sucked in her lips. Unlike her sister, she was predisposed to staying in one place. But her sister was of strong character. Whatever she said, Anna-Marie couldn't help falling in with her plans.
Wait a while, and I'll take you to the pictures. I've heard we're going to have a picture show in Dunavon just before Easter. I'll ask your grandfather.
Their grandmother's promise was forgotten in the work around the farm. First there were spring lambs to take to market, and a fresh spring turning into a typical summer of warm days interspersed by rain. The land turned verdant, the animals gave birth to their young, and the smell of all things growing made the air rich enough to taste. Autumn saw the harvesting of the fields, the laying in of winter fodder for the bad weather to come when the grass held no goodness. Anna-Marie loved life on the farm, though she tried not to show it to her sister. Venetia had never adjusted to the countryside, but what she did love were her grandmother's tales of a place called Hollywood in a magic land called America.
I'm going to go there one day, I tell you I am,
Venetia declared. Anna-Marie worshipped her sister, and always went along with whatever she'd said. Though they were chalk and cheese, they rarely argued, mainly because Anna-Marie always let Venetia have her own way. Just before Christmas, the travelling film show came to town. It was called The Jazz Singer, and it was the first talkie ever made.
It was made nearly 2 years ago, back in 1926, and people thought the talkies would never catch on, though apparently all films being made are now talkies. Now there's a thing. I didn't realise we were going to see people actually talking, their grandmother whispered to them. That was what persuaded your grandfather to let us see it. He can't believe it's true, and he won't believe it until he sees it with his own eyes. Or hears it with his ears, said Venetia.
Anna-Marie was wistful.
Is it really nearly 2 years since our mother died?
She whispered her question, unwilling to upset her grandmother whom she'd grown inordinately fond of.
Yes, Venetia snapped. 2 years living on a farm. It's not so bad. It's not like London. There are no animals in London. There are lights. I like lights, Venetia countered.
Anna-Marie sighed. Sometimes she found it difficult to cope with her sister's attitude. She loved the farm, loved her grandmother, and loved the animals. Not that she often admitted the fact to Venetia. Their grandmother shouted up the stairs that they were ready to see the film show.
Get down here now, or you won't be going.
Anna-Marie immediately set off for the stairs, pausing there to look at her sister.
Well, are you coming or not?
Venetia sucked in her lips. Anna-Marie breathed in deeply, fearing one of her sister's rebellious moods might be coming on. Venetia sprang into sudden life.
You wouldn't think I'd want to stay here, would you? I'll never want to stay here. I tell you that for nothing. We'll leave here. We'll both leave here.
Anna-Marie made no comment. She had no real wish to leave the farm and island. But if Venetia ever did insist on them leaving, she knew she would not have the strength to resist. Chapter 5. Magda, 1929. Snow began falling 2 days before Christmas. By morning it had thrown a thick blanket over a hushed neighbourhood. Just for once the old houses in Edward Street looked beautiful, like brides attired in wedding finery. Bridget Brodie's heart was still as frozen as the weather, and Magda still hadn't found a pencil in the house, and she so badly wanted to draw a Christmas scene and write a Christmas message. The old crayons were fine for drawing pictures, but she considered writing was best done with a pencil. Magda had just finished getting the fire to light when a blow from a chilblained hand flung her away from the feeble flames.
Bread! We need bread!
Aunt Bridget pointed at the ill-fitting door.
Will you get going now and stop staring at me like an idiot?
The door had twisted with age and barely reached the floor. Snow drifted through the gaps onto the flagstone floor where it melted and turned into ice overnight. Magda was beginning to get the measure of her aunt, and although she knew what it might earn her, her eyes flared with loathing. Bridget saw the look. A face creased with care and cruelty became like an evil mask, all pity devoured by poverty, compassion drowned by selfishness. Her lips curled back from twisted teeth yellowed with nicotine. She raised her hand.
Don't you look at me with your evil eyes, you dark witch, you. A witch can put a curse on you, Magda growled.
Her aunt looked at her dumbstruck. And it suddenly occurred to Magda that her aunt was superstitious. She actually believed her. The moment was short-lived.
Bread.
A threepenny piece hit the side of her cheek.
It's snowing again. Never mind the snow, you lazy little foreigner. What's a bit of snow? The likes of me are used to it, and you should get used to it too.
You never let me out other times.
Less of your back chat.
You're only letting me out because it's snowing.
Well, the ungratefulness of the child.
If I go out in this, then I'm going to go out other times too. Picking up the same blanket that covered her at night, she wound it around her thin form. The blanket had replaced her coat, which Aunt Bridget had decided was too small.
Sure, I'll give it to the nuns down at the convent. They'll give it to someone deserving, they will.
The blanket was old, unwashed and rough against her skin. She didn't care about its roughness, the ragged strips trailing along behind her, or the stink of dirt and smoke. It would keep her warm. It would hide who she was and the shame she felt at being so dirty, so shabbily dressed. Pressing her face against the gap at the side of the door, she felt the chills scything through, frosting her face like 1,000 needles. She was aching to get out, but she wasn't going to let her Aunt Bridget know that. She'd been kept a virtual prisoner for a whole year. The snow came up to her knees, soaking her skirt, her worn stockings and her canvas boots. The boots were suitable for summer or a clement climate, not for an English winter. Her winter boots had gone the same way as her coat in reality, paying for a second-hand fox fur for her aunt that stunk like a skunk and had rabid glass eyes. Warily, like a rabbit emerging from a burrow, Magda scrutinised her surroundings. Being locked up for so long had made her nervous of going out. Thanks to the snowfall, the alley was deserted. There were no gentlemen callers across the way, and there would be none until the snow had melted and the roads were passable. The sound of trams running on their twisted rails came from some way off on the main road into East London. Except for a few horse-drawn delivery carts, the trams had the road to themselves, without the hindrance of the buses, which were gradually taking their place. Hurrying was difficult, each step taking a great deal of effort. Raising one leg out of the snow, down into it again, repeating the process with aching legs and chilled bones. Her breath came in hot, steaming gasps. Her chest tightened with each cold breath, and the snow fell heavier, like a curtain of thick lace before her eyes. Winnie One-Leg hated cold weather. It made her bad leg ache even if she wasn't moving around or out in it. Pursing her upper lip, she removed a heated penny from the window pane and looked out. What she saw caused her to hold her breath. The snow was embellishing the mean buildings with an elegance they did not usually possess. Crumbling buildings with jutting first floors suddenly looked magical.
Like an old woman in a fine white cloak, she murmured to herself.
It wasn't as though she hadn't seen such a scene before, and she'd expected the whiteness, the grey sky, and the sudden beautification of lopsided houses and grim narrow streets. She'd not expected to see a monstrous cloak moving, seemingly of its own accord. What she perceived to be a cloak was, on reflection, a blanket. The figure, struggling to get itself and the blanket through the snow, was far from adult.
The pretty little girl living with Bridget Brodie.
So, the Connemara mare, the name they all knew Bridget Brodie by, had let the girl out. Somebody pointed out that the breed was one of the prettiest ponies in the British Isles, and it was an insult to compare the two. Somebody else had remarked that the child's name was Magda. Bridget Brodie was a hard woman. Winnie had seen her screaming and beating her husband James Brodie with a broken chair leg. It wouldn't come as any surprise that the child was receiving the same treatment. For one solitary moment she shared the child's pain, rubbing at her twisted leg, ruining the day she'd ever got involved with the likes of Reuben Fitz. She blinked away the memory. What was done, though she bitterly regretted what had happened. If only she'd had the courage to stand up to him and demanded he call the doctor when she was screaming in labour, unable to bring the child forth. But there, water under Waterloo Bridge, all in the past. Her thoughts and her eyes went back to the Brodie child. What kind of future could she look forward to? Not one she deserved if Bridget Brodie had anything to do with it. None of your business, Winnie One Leg. Hugging the warmth of the loaf close to her ribs beneath the scruffy blanket, Magda pressed on.